Hello and welcome back to the shop, everyone, for the fifth and final installment of the Sanmai Chef series. Here I'm just grinding off the excess length of the pin on this handle. 40 grit belt, I think. And there was very little extra length. If there had been more, I would start out with the bandsaw. Because if you grind off too much length and you're not careful, sometimes it generates a lot of heat. You can scorch your handle, but in this case, a 40 grit handled it pretty quick. Here I'm putting a fresher belt on, going lengthwise and leveling the entire surface of the handle. Any waste glue, the pin head, the wood slightly down to the G10, everything straight and flat on both sides. It's usually what I would start out doing. If the handle was a little crooked to the blade, which it shouldn't be, but you got to check it. You can always adjust it a little bit at this point by grinding more off one side or the other, especially if you left it a little heavy, so you can adjust it if you need to. This one didn't really need too much. Now we're going to start the profile of the handle by going vertical down the spine of the handle, and then just kind of working our way around the edge from there. Got to work the knuckle side sideways on the grinder here. I'm sure anyone that's ever made a knife in this fashion will be familiar with this sort of order of operations. Now we're going to switch over to a 220 grit J-Flex belt and go over the sides again, both sides, go over the back again, the spine of the handle, the profile all the way around, smooth everything up to a nice 220, particularly because the undersides of the handle and the spine of the handle there will have some spots where the flat that we establish now will be the final shape for it. So it's good to get the finish on those surfaces dialed early. It makes it easier to not have to return to them a bunch with progressively finer grits. And as I'm getting in there toward the hook of the handle, I do like to run the belt a little bit off the edge of the platen, ideally so it kind of feathers around that corner. I know it doesn't look like it, but I got a little bit of unsupported edge there. And with that, we'll move to the next step here. Got a 40 grit belt back on the machine, and I'm grinding a steep taper, a bevel onto the front of each side of the handle here, just forming a ramp down toward the blade, so it kind of pulls your hand toward the blade and into the blade a little bit, making the pinch grip comfortable. I'm just working this up by eye, starting with flat angles all the way across the block. That makes it easy to look at the bottom and top edges of those bevels and tune them up to each other by eye when we're getting the second side. Once I get close, I also like to flip it a lot and kind of do the top looking at it from both sides and the bottom looking at it from both sides, rather than rely on my perception of the trailing edge underneath the handle, whether or not it's even or not. I like to be looking at the top of the shape as I'm dialing it in. Now I'm grinding a much shallower taper behind the first taper that I established. The first taper will just end up being a pretty small facet on the front of this longer taper. just to finish kind of like finally blending the corner down with a facet. But now we're really defining kind of the front of the entire like front half, the fore of the handle shape here, tapering it down smoothly toward the blade. And I'm doing it with a rounding motion, as you can see here, just being careful not to hit anything with the corner of the belt that I don't want to scuff. I'm going to bring this shape kind of back behind the pin and a little bit kind of even with or slightly behind the angle change at the knuckle side of the grip in the middle of the handle there, that little point. And just try to build that shape up evenly on both sides and have it be kind of a pleasing rounded feel to the hand. One thing I do to kind of control this sort of shaping is you'll see that I set my hands up even with each other, but when I'm moving my hands to actually create the shape, I'm pivoting just a little bit at the wrist, but I'm not moving my arms so that they're staying set, so the angle of each other remains constant. And then to the degree that I can, I'm pivoting the workpiece by using my fingers so that the rotational axis of the blade remains as constant as possible. That way I don't get any surprise changes in angle or any digs with the corner of the belt. Once I establish where I want to be, then I can give it rotation without changing the angle of the axis. A lot of this is about identifying what is the comfortable way to grind the shape. You know, how can you access it? How can you best see it? The range of movement that you need, how can you best get it by holding your hands? And then once you have that for the one side, then try to establish it exactly the same but mirror with your opposite hand grip. If that grip worked well for the right side of the handle, it should work well on the left side of your handle if you just kind of mirror your body, your grip, and the knife when you do the other side. Quick evaluation there, and it looked like I had developed the shape pretty symmetrically there at 40 grit to get most of the material off without heating anything up too much. Now we're just going to go ahead, swap over to a 220 grit J-Flex, and then go over and take the 40 grit scratches out of what we just did. And you can see here that the front of that G10 piece is getting pretty narrow, which actually feels kind of nice not to have a big chunky thing there where you're trying to grip the handle. Now you can see also that that starter bevel that we did got worked down to where it's just this little scallop still existing in the G10. I went ahead and brought it back a little bit more off camera, but right now my camera decides to die due to the cold. So as I believe I mentioned in the previous video, this week it had a real cold snap. It was getting, 13 below and stuff, worse. And I have heat in my shop, but I actually don't use it when it gets this cold because it just burns so much fuel. So I'm out here just kind of toughing it out. Hands are freezing from wind off the buffer and everything, which is okay, but my camera deals with it more poorly than I do, and so it decided to quit and not really want to work too well in the shop, not charge up well, and I just had to keep working. So you guys missed some stuff, my apologies for that. You'll notice that this handle is basically done and it's getting buffed now. So what you missed, I'll run you through it real quick in a nutshell. After we had that taper, we put the the Morocco Platen on the Broadbeck. It's got that 6-inch contact wheel. We used that first with a 40 grit and then a 220 grit and then a 400 grit belt to first define and then sculpt these curved hollow facets in the back of the handle to give the palm swell feeling with a little bit more visual style. And then chamfered everything lightly so none of the corners were truly sharp. Went ahead and hand sanded everything first to 400 grit with a flexible baler belt style backing pad. Then brought it up to 1000 grit, and now we are having a buff at it. The first buff is usually just to check for scratches that I missed. An additional note of interest here, I'm running the original grinding belt drive buffing arm. I'm pretty sure I'm the guy that originally came up with this idea. Broadbeck even sells them now. And I think Peter Burt built one pretty early, but I built mine before Peter Burt back in like 2009, 2010 at the latest. Hardcore Grinders had a grinder with a buffer attachment like this, but it wasn't a primary belt drive off of the grinding belt. As far as I know, I noticed the fact that you could just use a grinding belt to drive attachments off of the wheel like that. Now that I've finished tooting my own horn, I will mention we're using a 10-inch loose buff here, loose cotton buff, and it's got scratchless pink compound on it. And because we're using my old homebrew grinder, it's a 3 horsepower variable speed grinder, so we're not buffing at a very fast speed here, which I like about doing it this way. I have it dialed down to like 50 hertz, so it's a little slower. It's a little safer that way. If it grabs stuff, it doesn't fling it as hard at least. But I'm being careful not to put like the sharp edge of anything toward the buff. I'm working at the center line of the buff, generally speaking. And I'm being very conscious the whole time not to dig into the buff and to hold things carefully and predictably, because these things are dangerous. You may have noticed me dripping a little bit of oil on the handle. Now that's not any particular wood or finishing oil, that's just turbine oil that I use for my grinder spindle. But it's nice and thin and low viscosity even at these cold temperatures in the shop, and I like to oil a handle before I buff it. It just helps the buffing compound actually cut, and it helps compound not stick to the handle surface quite as bad, which can give you a streaky finish. So it just kind of helps wet things out, gives you a better result. Less heat too. So after I had buffed it all out, spot sanded in a couple spots with 1000 grit, rebuffed it all out, the handle was good. I always run soft paper towel on the blade wrapped with tape. I don't tape blades directly anymore, as I find that that'll just screw the finish up too many times, the residue of the tape. But the paper towel is always kind to it. So I've taken that off, and now I've got a 600 grit belt on there. The edge is thin enough that you can start power sharpening it with a 600 grit belt. And I'm just going along a few passes per side, shouldn't take more than that, at a pretty low angle of about 10 degrees per side to establish a burr. Every time I get done with a pass, I bring it over to the light, look at it from the back side, from the spine, and observe the burr, observe if it's evenly established all the way down the edge, and then give it another pass and keep alternating sides if it needs more. Well, we got our burr established on this last pass, so time to go over to the other machine, the 1x42 Veal S5 grinder. This one I'm running a 1x42 leather belt, and it is impregnated with green chrome buffing dope, which is very good at putting a fine polish onto hardened steel, or just polishing that burr off lightly. Back and forth with light pressure, same angle as we sharpen from, trying not to push too hard and roll the edge. And it should take a few passes per side, and we should have that entire burr stropped off and a mirror polish established on the edge with a little bit of tooth left on it from the grinding belt. This is generally the level of sharpness that I send my knives out at. It's razor sharp. You can absolutely get knives sharper than this, particularly if you're going to work them on like a Kodacule or like J-Nat stones or something, go up to 30,000 grit. There are extremists in the field of sharpening. I'm not one of them. However, I figure if I send this out good and sharp, it's shaving hair all the way down the edge effortlessly. If I send it out this sharp to my customer and they prefer to have a more specialized edge on it, I have sharpener extremist friends that I can always recommend them to get like a high stone finish on their edge if they prefer that. At any rate, a little dry shave there, and now we'll just cut a little bit of paper with every portion of the edge and see how it does. That definitely passes that sharpness test. And now, because I've just dulled it even a tiny amount from cutting paper with it, I'll go ahead and give it one more zing per side so it goes to the customer in absolutely fresh condition. And now we're on to the finished video of it from Instagram.
Just finished this guy up. Figured I'd share before I ship it out. This is going to a knife maker friend of mine. It's wrought iron, Montana Bridge wrought iron over a 52100 core. Came out pretty neat. Nice and thin and light. It's very slight convex grind. Sculpted Amboina burl handle. Weighs in at 5.9 ounces. 9-inch long cutting edge. 2 1/16 tall at the heel, and has a nice little handle trim cap on the front of black G10 through stainless pin in the tang. Thanks for looking.
And with that, we've reached the end of this 5-part series. My apologies again for the missed work sections during this last installment. The weather here was quite difficult to deal with this week, but we persevered. I really appreciate you guys watching, and stay tuned for something a little bit different coming next week. All right, everybody, stay warm out there. Bye-bye now.